Ladies and gentlemen, this is DVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. On this episode, we dive into the Kremlin's latest power play, and this time it's against its own veterans. The very people who risked their lives in a completely avoidable invasion on foreign soil are now caught in a bizarre choice between loyalty and dissent, a conflict the Kremlin seems determined to control like a puppet show. With so many veterans scarred by the horrors of the war, the cracks already start forming. With crime perpetrated by those returning from Ukraine on the rise, we ask the question, is Russia heading towards a crisis magnitudes bigger than the Kremlin is prepared for? Well, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Russia, to say the least, has invested a lot of time, money and blood into its army, all to invade a neighbour who had the audacity to strive towards a different future than the so-called Russian world. Sooner or later, however, the war will come to an end, be it through ceasefire, capitulation or some other method. Once the ashes have settled and new lines have been drawn, what will come next for Russia's massive horde of troops? For the synapses of the Kremlin, the outward answer is simple: more.
We will continue to improve the combat capabilities of the army and navy and their combat readiness as an essential component of Russia's security, a guarantee of its sovereign present and future.
Observers point out that Russia's current war machine is not sustainable. It has a massive mobilized army. Even if some of it will be needed to subjugate occupied territories, something will have to be done with the rest. Not to mention the toll that the existence of such an army has exacted on the Russian economy. Ordinary Russians are feeling the bite of sanctions and lack of access to certain products, even if they claim to support the war. Is there a way out? The American president has floated an idea, on and off, about a possible solution, a ramp-off of sorts.
I'm going to meet with China and I'm going to meet with Russia, and we're going to see if we can de-escalate it, we can bring it down military.
Whether this idea, one of many proposed by Donald Trump in recent weeks, comes to fruition will not change the fact that the landscape of Eastern Europe has been changed for a generation by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, if not more.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Now, you might be wondering, what's the big deal with veterans in Russia? Well, let's rewind a little bit because it's a rather sour subject, even if we go back just a couple of decades. After the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, debacle that left countless veterans grappling with what came to be known as Afghan syndrome, the government learned a harsh lesson. The Kremlin now knows that when you neglect those who have served, you risk igniting a firestorm of discontent, a rebellion fueled by the very human need for dignity and recognition. Fast forward to today, and the Kremlin is desperately trying to avoid a modern-day return of that disastrous sequel. So, what exactly is the Kremlin up to? Well, in a series of initiatives with names like Defenders of the Fatherland Safe Fund and Time of Heroes Higher School of Public Administration, the regime is essentially saying, we love our veterans, if they toe the line. The strategy is straightforward. Co-opt influential veteran figures, establish state-controlled organizations, and most crucially, stamp out any signs of independent civil society that might challenge the status quo. In a twist of irony, the regime is using the rhetoric of preventing Afghan syndrome as its rallying cry. So instead of addressing the real trauma experienced by veterans, which often lead to addiction, crime, and social alienation after the Soviet-Afghan War, the Kremlin is weaponizing that term to justify its heavy-handed interventions. It's like using a life-saving medicine as a sedative. You claim it's for their own good while simultaneously disarming any hope for a genuine support system. Now, let's also remember the declaration by Putin himself, who officially dubbed 2025 the Year of the Defender of the Fatherland. Now, that's not exactly a celebration of valor, it's a signal that the Kremlin is doubling down on this mission to mold veterans into loyal subjects. And why wouldn't they be afraid? After all, history tells us that veterans, with their shared experiences and bonds forged in the crucible of war, have a knack for uniting against injustice. The Kremlin's fear isn't entirely unfounded, it's just a bit too paranoid. Adding fuel to the fire, high-ranking officials like Sergei Kirilenko have warned behind closed doors that Russian veterans adapt poorly to civilian life. The influx of demobilized soldiers could lead to a surge in violent crimes and social unrest. And that has already begun happening. It's a convenient narrative. If veterans are the problem, then the solution is more control, less freedom, and an endless cycle of state intervention. The Kremlin's crackdown on independent veteran groups isn't simply a bureaucratic measure. It's a calculated move to prevent any spark that might light the fuse of broader societal change. Moscow's campaign against independent veteran civil society is a stark reminder that when power is concentrated in the hands of a few, the voices of the many are easily silenced. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Witold Rutkiewicz, a senior fellow at the Center for Eastern Studies. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, happy to be with you.
So it turns out that recruiting prisoners to go to war has its downside. Today we're trying to examine the aftermath of some of these veterans returning to Russia and causing a bit of a trouble. Now, just can you help us understand how big and widespread is that issue affecting Russia as of the moment?
Well, I don't have any figures. I think that will be difficult to find. We have to rely on sort of fragmentary evidence from Russian media. So it's difficult to assess because we can judge it indirectly because of the concern that is kind of bubbling up even in the official, in the official controlled media. So this is clearly a problem.
Like you mentioned, even in official...
But I wouldn't exaggerate it.
Right. But like you mentioned, even in Russian official media outlets, this is being kind of brought up as an issue. We do know that with a narrative so tightly controlled, if they have to admit it, there's probably something going on with rampant crime. And, well, do you think that this might actually affect Russians' incentive to, well, kind of honor the ceasefire that is being negotiated right now?
Well, I think all this talk about ceasefire is really getting ahead of reality. I think this reflects more our that is Western tiredness with the war and the wish to see the end to it rather than reality, because we still don't. The Russian side clearly rejects the idea of a ceasefire without preconditions. They just want full surrender of Ukraine and basically, one might say, surrender of the West. They are quite clear about this and quite consistent. So, of course, things might change, but we are still very far from that. The negotiations really haven't started yet. The procedure is supposed to be the following. The Americans are supposed to name their team, and then the Russians are supposed to name their team. And the first thing that they are going to do, and before that, a different team is supposed to talk about lifting the restrictions on the diplomatic representatives of both sides. And this meeting is going to take place today, or is taking place today, as far as I know, in Turkey. So we are still very far ahead, and there's absolutely, to me, it's not clear that a decision to cease combat operations is going to be taken anytime soon. I think it's actually very unlikely. I think there's a high probability that the high terms, the very exacting terms that the Russian side is demanding is going to be a major obstacle to that. And I think the Russian side is prepared to continue military operations. So I think this, thinking about consequences of ceasefire, especially on the Russian side, I think it's premature. And I also think there's a lot of speculation among those experts who argue that, in fact, the Russian side is not interested in ceasing the war because it will create all kinds of problems, taking into account that the war has been a great bonus to the regime in terms of providing with legitimacy and providing justification for various measures further restricting and tightening up the dictatorial regime that we have in Russia. So these experts argue that perhaps because of that, Russia is actually interested, the leadership of Russia is actually interested in continuing the war. I think there is a lot of truth in this, but I think also that if the terms are right, the Russian side will be willing to stop, to cease the war, to stop the war, and sort of to consume the fruits of it. But that's, I think, very unlikely.
All right, so if you can help me understand that, because we do see like kind of two different narratives running when it comes to whether or not Russia wants to keep this thing going. On one hand, we have people saying that all these sanctions have been hurting the Russian economy, their military is in shambles, they won't be able to sustain this war of attrition, how they're lacking in military personnel and vehicles. On the other hand, like you mentioned, there's also another side of thought which says that this war continuing and prolonging is actually beneficial to Russia for a whole array of different reasons. Perhaps one of the topics we can touch on today is that their internal issue could probably be delayed when it comes to addressing them for the Russian government. What's your take on this? Do you think that the Russians actually do have any sort of incentive internally to keep it going, or do you think maybe there's also this kind of message that they're trying to send in order to give them a better position when it comes to negotiations?
I think they feel they are strong enough to persevere, to score a big win. A big win meaning subordination of Ukraine. And actually, if you look at their demands and hints, they want to pose before the West, before the US, the demands that they put forward just before the war started in February of 22. You remember the draft treaties that they proposed to NATO and Washington in December 21, January 22, which basically demanded the withdrawal of NATO forces and American forces from Central Europe. So in spite of the fact that the war is conducted, the hot war is conducted only in Ukraine, Russian objectives in this war are actually wider and concern not only Ukraine but also the entire Western alliance. And these are the stakes. And I don't think that the Russian side is willing to give up on that. In other words, I don't think we are facing a situation in which we can count on quick, even medium-term ceasefire and the end of hostilities.
Right. Do you see that kind of changing the calculation of the new U.S. administration? I think Trump coming into this kind of oversimplifying the situation, thinking he could get this deal done. And I think early stages of the negotiation, he sees Zelensky as someone hard to negotiate with, not willing to budge on his position. And now we see, apparently Russia also isn't that easy when it comes to negotiation as, contrary to what Trump believes. Do you think that that might also change his perception towards Russia now that he realized, okay, they're also not willing to budge either?
Well, that's a big question. I'm not a specialist in American affairs and American politics, but it seems to me that this is at the present moment there are no good specialists who could with confidence assess the situation, because of the peculiarity of the current situation, the political situation in the United States, and peculiarity of Donald Trump as a political leader and political personality. We simply don't know. There are two possibilities here. One is exactly the one that you mentioned, that Mr. Trump is going to going to realize that the price that the Russian side is willing to wants to exact in return for the end of hostility is too high, and even from the point of view of national interest, American national interest, as Donald Trump would define it, But there is another possibility, which I think is actually more likely. This is just a hunch, that he would be willing to, he would lose interest, and he would be willing to settle for an image of a success. Namely, he would pursue the signature of some kind of treaty and agreement ending hostilities. But that would mean a fundamental weakening of American strategic position globally. Whether he's prepared to do that, we don't know. I hope not, but we have to prepare here in Europe. We have to prepare for the worst, and assume that this might be actually possible. This kind of revolutionary concessions on part of Trump in return for PR success and a severing of signing of some, basically would be surrender document. That this is a possibility.
Right, and last but not least, when it comes to keeping the war going, I'm also wondering how big do you think is Moscow's dependence on its military-industrial complex to keep it afloat?
Well, I think this is the other way around. I mean, they managed to boost their military production and build up their military industrial capacity during the last 3 years much faster than the West. Even though, if you look at the figures and the economic potential, the West was in much better position. So I think they have sufficient resources to build up their military potential and to keep up the war. What is problematic is the broader economic situation, which, according to experts, gives Russia perhaps 1, 2, 3 years to continue. But there's another important element here, because the Russian economy has depended during the last 3 years in its mobilization effort on cooperation with China, which is a key element in the whole picture. And I think looking at the Chinese interests, I think that China would step in if it has to. It hasn't done that to the degree it could have, but if Russia faced economic problems, fundamental economic problems, I think the Chinese would be willing to underwrite Russian economy just to prevent Russian collapse and Russian defeat.
Right, so there's a lot of puzzles that is still going into this. And in the meantime, thank you so much for giving us your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Cheers. And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East I don't want to miss. Investigative news outlet Sistema reports that, according to anonymous EU officials, Hungary have been pushing to waive sanctions on certain Russian billionaires, including a federal minister.
A report recently uncovered Hungary has demanded that EU travel bans and asset freezes be lifted for 8 Russian citizens. 7 of these individuals had previously challenged the imposed sanctions in EU courts. The report also points out that they would have to be removed from the sanctions list before Hungary agrees to the extension of EU sanctions on Russia over its war in Ukraine, renewed by Brussels every 6 months via unanimous vote. These include measures that target over 2,400 individuals and entities.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is expected to travel to Washington as early as February 28th to finalize a deal on minerals with the U.S. Kyiv previously rejected an earlier draft of the agreement over a lack of security guarantees.
After a series of tense negotiations, Ukraine and the United States have reportedly reached an agreement on economic cooperation, focusing on creating an investment fund for Ukraine's reconstruction that will be financed through mineral resource projects. The fund will be managed jointly by both Kyiv and Washington on equal terms. The deal targets future mineral resource development instead of existing extraction operations. The current agreement does not reportedly include all the security guarantees that Kyiv was hoping for, but Zelensky has said that it contains at least some reference to certain guarantees.
Romania's far-right presidential hopeful Călin Ceausescu has been taken in for questioning as part of an investigation surrounding last year's annulled presidential election.
Georgescu was questioned by Romanian police for several hours. Following his release, he reaffirmed his intent to run in the upcoming May presidential election. While he was not detained, he has been put under judicial supervision for 60 days, prohibiting him from leaving the country and posting what has been called hateful content on the internet. The country's General Prosecutor's Office charged him with 6 offences, including founding or supporting fascist, racist, xenophobic, and anti-Semitic organizations. Georgescu won the first round of the November 2024 presidential election. The vote was, however, annulled by Romania's Constitutional Court over reports of Russian interference with the campaign process. He is known for his strong anti-Western views, including being critical of NATO and opposing Romanian support for Ukraine in its defense against the Russian invasion.
The United States is reportedly interested in developing its ties with Central Asian countries. The Trump administration has been maintaining the policy of its predecessor to improve relations with countries in the region.
The Trump State Department has shown a lot of interest in pursuing one Biden-era policy, the C5+1 format. This is an initiative meant to increase Washington's influence in Central Asia. Secretary of State Marco Rubio himself has emphasized Washington's interest in the region during a meeting with Uzbekistan's foreign minister. Various reports indicate that the main driver behind this policy is Central Asia's vast reserves of natural resources. This concerns not only gas and oil, but also various minerals and rare earths that are used in high-tech devices, clean energy and defense. There may also be a geographical angle to Washington's interest, as Central Asia is located right on China's western border. One of the leading tenets of Donald Trump's new term has been to limit Chinese economic influence across the globe.
And that's all for this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.